Hey, what's up, not GDC? If you follow my channel, you probably know that I've worked on plenty of projects involving water in some way, right? Dynamic waves, Gerstner waves, flow maps, and all kind of other experiments, and I'm not even done. There's cool stuff coming up soon, probably next month, so stay tuned. Anyway, today I'm going to explain a technique I used to create the water in my tropical diorama project. Now, what I was doing back then wasn't technically perfect, and there's a few things I explained in that breakdown video that aren't quote-unquote correct, and that's also why it was about time I made an actual tutorial. There's typically two main ways to render that kind of ocean in a real-time application. There's Gerstner waves, and I've made a long video on the subject already, so feel free to take a look at it. In a nutshell, Gerstner waves are awesome, but they come with some constraints. Namely, you hit some kind of performance barrier as soon as you want to do any kind of realistic ocean simulation, because it's just too expensive to compute tons and tons of Gerstner waves, which you kinda need to do to have a realistic water behavior. So the second way and the actual state of the art, despite being quite old already, is to use FFT, which stands for Fast Fourier Transform. It's a huge mathematical tool used across all kinds of scientific domains, and I highly recommend you watching Veritation's video on the subject if you want to know more. It's fantastic, but then what isn't when it comes to Derek's work? Anyway, I'm going off topic. Implementing an FFT water simulation is not easy. There's plenty of papers on the subject, so if you really want to dive in and get your hands dirty, it's doable, alright? I've yet to do that myself, but one day. In the meantime, I'm going to show you a technique to kinda cheat. It's certainly not perfect, right? It has its limitations and all, but still it might be a helpful trick to know. So I'm going to show you how to use Blender and utilize its Ocean modifier, which actually is an FFT Ocean simulation, to bake a looping, tileable FFT Ocean simulation into a flipbook that you can then use in-engine to cheaply create quite a decent looking water. It isn't as straightforward as it sounds though. Creating and sampling a tiling flipbook comes with some complications, but we'll get to that soon enough. Alright, let's get started then. First things first, create a plane, make sure it's a 0, 0, 0 and add an Ocean modifier to it. I'm going to increase the render resolution, reduce the spatial size to 40 and the wind velocity to 4 meters per second. Then I'm going to create a camera, press Alt-R to reset its rotation, center it on that water plane, move it up a little bit like so, and change its type to orthographic. Then I need to change its orthographic scale to 40 to match that Ocean modifier spatial size setting. Then press 0 on the numpad and I have a top view of that water surface. Only thing to fix still is the render resolution. 512 by 512 will do the trick. Cool, now that Ocean modifier creates a tiling water surface, which is awesome, meaning the displacement on the left here perfectly matches the displacement on the right. However, there's blank spaces creeping in within the render region. To fix this, I'm going to set repeat X and Y to 2 and then move the camera in X and Y by 20 meters to be dead centered on those 4 water planes. If you squint your eyes and pay attention to the edges, you should be able to spot the same exact shapes going in and out of the render region, right? So it should perfectly tile. To actually test this though, I'm going to switch to the shading tab, create a material and add a texture coordinate node. Drag the normal pin and plug that in the emission. Make sure that the base color is black, specular is 0, and also make sure that the world color is black and strength is 0. Press Z in the viewport and choose rendered. Okay, that looks wrong. There's two things happening here. First, that normal is actually a unit vector in world space, so it could be positive or negative x, y and z. Negative values aren't necessarily an issue if you work with 16 or 32-bit textures, but normal maps are usually stored in 8-bit textures, so I'm going to remap that world vector with a multiply add node. Multiplier is going to be 0.5 minus 0.5 to flip the Y channel. That's because Blender and Unreal Engine use different coordinate systems, don't worry about it, and 0.5. Add is going to be 0.5 as well. That's much better. However, if you're familiar with normal maps, you might have picked up on the washed out colors. This doesn't look right. That's due to the sRGB color management, so I need to turn that off here. Render again, then press N, go to the View tab, turn on Repeat Image, and it does look like I have a perfectly tiling normal map. Sweet. Now, a quick word about that Ocean modifier. It does have options to bake that water simulation, like displacement and normals and foam, but I'm not going to use it. Honestly, I failed to produce a bake that I could work with. The normalized bakes, for instance, look super weird. I'm really not sure what color space that's in, and it's also wave normalized before displacement is applied, and I really don't want that. The displacement map bakes is also non-normalized as far as I remember, so it needs to be stored in at least 16-bit textures. Anyway, it may sound confusing, but don't worry about it. We are going to do things our own way. Moving on, this now needs to be animated, so let's go to the animation tab. I'm going to go to frame 1, set time to 0, press I to add a keyframe, and do the same with scale. Then I'm going to go to frame 65, so the number of frames I want in my flipbook, 64, plus 1, and set time to 2, scale to 1, and press I to keyframe once again. I'm then going to duplicate that ocean modifier, so press Shift D while the mouse is over it. Change its geometry setting to displace, then back at frame 0 it's going to pick up where that first ocean modifier stopped at, so time was 2 and scale was 1. And then at frame 65, time is going to be 4 and scale 0. By the way, feel free to tweak that time value to have a slower or faster animation, right? Just make sure that if this modifier ends up at whatever time value, say 3, this one needs to start at 3 and end at 6, okay? There's one last step. I'm going to press A to select all keyframes, press V and change to vector to have linear interpolation. Then change the timeline's end setting to 64, press play, and voila, it perfectly loops. Okay, so I'm going to render that animation. Now if you follow along that tutorial, pause now because I'm going to proceed forward, but you shouldn't yet. I actually need to do a critical tweak to this setup, but I feel like it wouldn't make sense to explain why right now, so just hang on, it will make sense in a minute. Alright, so PNG, RGB, 8 bits is fine, select a folder and render the animation. Once that's done, I still need to pack those 64 frames into a single flipbook texture, right? And that can be achieved in many ways. Slate is an option, it's free and easy to use. Image Magic with a simple command line is also an option, or any decent 2D software really, GIMP, Photoshop, whatever. Open these images and create the flipbook texture manually or using scripts. There's plenty of options here. As long as the result is from left to right, top to bottom, you're good to go. Note that this flipbook is going to be quite a big texture, right? Baking 64 frames with a 512 resolution is going to result in a 4K flipbook, so that's definitely one of the downsides of this technique, it's quite memory heavy. Plus a 512 texture resolution isn't going to look super sharp up close, so that's something to keep in mind. Anyway, time to test that normal map flipbook in Engine, I guess, so let's switch to Unreal Engine. I'm going to add a plane, create a simple material, gray color, full roughness, great, apply it to that mesh, then import that flipbook normal map, make sure it's actually imported as a normal map, good. Okay, so playing a flipbook texture in Engine is all about creating a counter to move UVs around and sample a given tile within that flipbook. How can that be done? Let's start with time. I'm going to use a debug scalar values material function plugged into the emissive color to see what's going on. That's the time the engine I've been currently running, so not super useful on its own. A first multiply will let me control the flipbook's frame rate. For now I'll keep it at 1, so the debug value doesn't go crazy and I can try and explain what's going on. Then use floor to round it to the smallest integer and divide it by the amount of frames the flipbook has in x, so 8. I also need to use frac to get rid of that integer part. That way, every second, or whatever frame rate is set here, this increases by an eighth, which is exactly what I'm looking for, right? Texture coordinates are always in a 0 to 1 range, so assuming the flipbook has 8 frames in x, the first frame is at 0 in x, the second at 0.125, the third at 0.25, and so on. Okay, so I essentially built a function to shift the coordinate at which that flipbook is sampled and jump from frame to frame, at least in x for now. The y coordinate then needs to shift by 1 frame vertically only once an entire line has been sampled, right? And that's once every how many frames there are per line? 8. So divide by 8, then flow again and divide by the number of frames in y. Let's pretend our flipbook is 8 by 4 frames for now. To see what's going on, I'm going to switch to a debug float2 material function, make a vector2, and that let me clean the graph and use a single frac here. Sweet. So the first value shifts the texture coordinates in x by an eighth every second, and the second value shifts the texture coordinates in y by a fourth every 8 seconds, which is to be expected for an 8x4 flipbook. Now that's understood, hopefully, I'm going to increase the frame rate to say 15 for now. Okay, that's not yet actual texture coordinates. In fact, if I was to plug that in a texture sampler, it wouldn't output anything really, and it would flicker somehow. Because that's not a range of coordinates, that's just coordinates that for now jump around and point to a pixel or in between pixels somewhere in that texture. What I need to do is to make use of an actual range of coordinates and use this to shift that range of coordinates. So UVs or world position are both an option, but for now I'm going to use UVs because it will more easily let me illustrate a particular issue. Wait, what issue? Well, let's see. The flipbook does seem to play, but obviously all frames are visible and it seems to scroll somehow. That's actually to be expected because that plane mesh has the following UVs and it covers the whole 0 to 1 range, both in X and Y, so it's like the entire flipbook is sampled and the entire flipbook is shifted from frame to frame. So what I'm looking for is to sample a single frame, like UVs are zoomed in on just one frame. And dividing UVs by the amount of frames in X and Y will precisely do that. Moving on, let's try and make that texture tile, say 4 times, because remember we were under the tiling water surface, right? So multiply those coordinates by say 4. Whoa, what's going on? Well, the multiply here is obviously undoing that divide. Multiply anything by say 2 and then divide by 2 does nothing in the end. To go around this, I'm going to use fraction and make UVs loop on and remain in a 0 to 1 range, which will still tile that texture, but without working against that divide here. But now there are visible seams. We were sure that the water surface was tiling. What's going on? Well, in order to render smooth textures, regardless of the view distance, the engine applies a linear interpolation. And you can actually see it in effect here if we zoom in enough, right? There's color from neighboring frames bleeding inside that frame, and that obviously prevents it from tiling properly, because this edge now no longer perfectly matches the opposite edge. But it gets even worse when MIP maps come into play. If you don't know what that is, well, a game engine creates a chain of downscaled version of every single texture, so that based on distance, it samples the right amount of pixels. There's no need to sample a 4K texture if it's teeny tiny on screen, right? It would result in a noisy mess. And that process is done offline, so it's pre-computed and the result is stored in what we call MIP maps. And so when downscaling a texture, say by a factor of 2, every grid of 2x2 pixels are going to be somewhat averaged to create one single pixel. And that kinda leads to even more color from neighboring frames bleeding in due to that linear interpolation. It's a bit hard to explain, but hopefully you get the idea. However, it's only one part of the issue, because once MIP maps are built, the engine still has to figure out which MIP map to sample. And to do that, the engine basically computes the rate of change in texture coordinates. So say these are typical coordinates, it's a smooth gradient, great. The engine can deal with that and say, okay, there's that amount of change in that gradient on screen, so I can deduce that it's best if I use this MIP map. Now, because fraction must be used here to make the texture coordinate tile, while zoomed in on a given flipbook frame, there's a sudden jump in that gradient, and the engine have no longer any idea what to do with that, which results in visual artifacts, okay? Fortunately, fixing that second issue is quite trivial. First, change the texture sampler setting to override how the engine computes the MIP level, and do that using custom derivatives instead. Then use the same gradient but without that troublesome jump in value, so essentially the exact same thing but without the fraction, and use ddx and ddy to compare the value of that gradient at a given pixel and at the neighboring pixel in x and y, and derive a rate of change in screen space and give the engine a way to know which MIP map to sample. Note that keeping the same rate of change to compute the derivatives and to sample the texture is critical to ensure the correct MIP level is sampled. For instance, say I skip that divide here. Those derivatives then output a rate of change that is 8 times greater compared to those UVs, and thus the engine thinks it needs to sample a much higher MIP map and it looks super blurry. It's a bit technical, but anyway, that gets rid of those ugly artifacts. Sweet, but it's still not perfect because the troublesome linear interpolation is still at play. Alright, then back in Blender. The goal here is to do what we call oversampling. By the way, shout out to Ryan Brooks for creating an excellent article on the subject. I highly suggest you to take a look at it, link will be in the video description below. Okay, so oversampling, it essentially means rendering a bit of what's outside this render region. That way the actual tiling texture no longer takes up the whole frame, but lies within the frame itself with some kind of inner safety margin. So the linear interpolation that may happen on those edges may blend with pixels still belonging to that same frame and not neighboring frames. Now the amount of oversampling to add, meaning the amount of extra pixels to include, has to be carefully thought of and is directly linked to how many MIP levels you want to fix. Again, I'll let you pick at Ryan Brock's article to have more details. Just know that if you include one extra pixel on each side, the first MIP level is fixed and seams will no longer be visible up to a certain distance. Eventually, at an even greater distance, the engine will sample the second MIP level and seams will start to be visible again. And to fix the second MIP level, you include 2 extra pixels on each side. Third level, 4 pixels, and 8, 16, and so on. So it's like you double the margin each time and thus you lose quite a bit of your actual texture resolution. But then it becomes pretty much impossible to spot such subtle tiling seams past a distance, so you can compromise. Usually fixing up to the third MIP level is plenty enough. Okay, so let's do that. MIP level 3 need 4 extra pixels on each side, so 8 in total. But how much do I need to zoom out to actually include 8 extra pixels? That orthographic scale is certainly not in pixels, right? Well, my render resolution is 512 by 512 pixels, and that render region is 40 by 40 units. So a single pixel corresponds to 40 divided by 512. So to fix the third MIP level, I need to zoom out by an extra 40 divided by 512 times 4 times 2. And that's why I said earlier to pause the tutorial if you were following along. I feel like that critical trick needed some context to be explained. Anyway, now you can render that animation and create your final flipbook. Back in engine, I now need to take that oversampling, that extra margin within each frame, into account. So first I'm going to shift UVs by the amount of extra pixels added, 4, divided by the texture resolution, 512. That's 4 texels. This results in UVs, quote-unquote starting where the tiling texture top left corner now lies within that flipbook frame. But obviously now that it's been offset, it kinda overflows on another frame, so I need to scale UVs down by double that margin, so it ends up where the tiling texture bottom right corner is. And that little multiply setup will do just that. Sweet, now it's perfect, we are done with tiling artifacts, yay! Well, almost perfect. There's one last issue. The flipbook animation isn't that smooth, and that's obviously due to the frame rate. 15 isn't much. I may increase it to 30 and that's better, but what if my game runs at 60 FPS and I want a better smooth flipbook animation? Well, I may increase the frame rate to 60, but that would obviously increase the animation speed and I may want to actually keep some kind of artistic control over it. Here it's certainly playing too fast now because that flipbook has only 64 frames to play, right? That's when linear interpolation comes into play. Now I'm going to switch to a debug flipbook, one that has each frame index written in plain text, to better explain what I'm about to do. So I'm going to duplicate that entire setup to sample that flipbook a second time, but one frame ahead using a simple add one. Okay, then I'm going to lerp between the two textures, but based on what alpha value? Remember, I'm rounding time to the lowest integer using floor, so that if the frame rate is, say, 1, this increments by 1 integer every second. And using fraction on that time will output the time in between that second, meaning if I plug that in the alpha value, the current frame blends with the next frame to come during that second. And then this increments, so the next frame becomes the current frame, and it starts to blend again. This results in a linearly interpolated flipbook, which looks way smoother. Frame rate can be quite drastically lowered, and you keep some artistic control over it. Awesome. An even better solution would be to use a flow-based interpolation, but that's an entire other topic, maybe in another video. Anyway, the downside is obviously the slight increase in performance cost. There are 2 texture samplers just to play one flipbook, and texture samplers aren't free. Okay, sweet, we are done with the technical side of things. We have a flipbook that tiles with no visible seams and that loops on and on. Yay! Let's get to actually create the water material now. So first of all, I only have a normal map flipbook to work with, and I'd like at least a displacement map flipbook. Back in Blender, using a simple carefully scaled bounding box to generate object-based coordinates, I can use the Z component to create a normalized linear gradient, and that's the height map, as simple as that. I may also use pointiness to generate some kind of crest map. Now that's a bit finicky to work with, here it seems to not cooperate very well, and adding a subdivide modifier usually does the trick. Then make sure to remap the value, switch to cycles, and you get that kind of texture, which may have its purpose. Back in Engine, import those two textures, and make sure they are set to grayscale linear. Now I'd suggest you to collapse all that logic into a material function to ease this process, but this video is already long enough, so for this dirty water material example, I'm just going to duplicate that setup to sample the height map flipbook and offset vertices in Z like so. However, the material doesn't compile anymore. That's because using derivatives is only relevant, and thus available, in pixel shaders, and world position offset logic is executed in vertex shaders, so I need to revert to a normal texture sampler, but that won't actually cause any tiling issue here, don't worry. Then plug the normal map into the actual normal and not the emissive, apply that material on a subdivided plane, and here is a working example of an FFT Ocean that is quite cheap to render. Now again, using high-res flipbooks come with a non-negligible memory cost, and in the end it's just a tiling texture and the wave pattern will probably be noticeable at a distance, nothing is perfect. Okay, so next step will be to actually make use of the single layer water shading model and add the required output node and parameters like so. Then I built a material function, just like I suggested earlier, to let me duplicate that flipbook sampling logic way more easily and keep the material clean. So here I sample the wave height flipbook to displace vertices, here I sample the wave normals, and I use the neat trick, which is to sample that flipbook once as a base normal, and then use the sample normal as a direction to distort the coordinates at which that flipbook is sampled a second time at a much smaller scale to add secondary detail waves and have them displaced by the main waves. Then here I sample the wave height flipbook again and wave crest flipbook and combine them both with some controls for the fall off and strength to drive the water opacity, roughness and specular. And honestly, without doing much work, thanks to that great water shading model, you quite easily end up with that kind of result, which looks sweet. Great, one last final thing, you might have picked up on that subtle particle effect. It's quite cheaply done because it's really just to illustrate what's possible. So it's worth knowing that most logic you can do in a material, you can do in a Niagara GPU emitter. And so if you can build a logic using math to sample a flipbook frame at a given pixel position, you can do the exact same thing to sample that exact same flipbook at a given particle position. Build the flipbook coordinates, build the flipbook frame counter, offset coordinates with that counter, and sample the flipbook, done. And so I do that here once upon particle spawn to sample the wave height flipbook. Then here I do a quick test and kill any spawn particle if the wave at that position isn't high enough. I also sample the wave normal flipbook to add some initial velocity to the particles based on the wave slope, and then use the sampled wave height to vertically project particles onto the water surface. And then particles are blown away with a wind force. Voila, that's the end of this long and quite technical video. I hope it made sense and that you learned a thing or two along the way. Files are available as a tier 1 reward on my Patreon, so feel free to join in if you want to support me on my work and have access to all kind of cool educative projects. Feel free to also leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you liked the content. Thanks for watching, thanks for your support, I'll see you in the next video, take care of yourself, bye bye!